Good afternoon and welcome to Great Decisions 2022. My name is Tim DeRoche. I'm the Director of Programs here at WorldOregon. I wish I could see your faces, but I know that you're out there and I'm really glad you could join us for the first of our 8-part series. Great Decisions, of course, is one of our perennially popular events that we do annually. We have been doing this event since 1953. It is almost 70 years old. It is the oldest, largest grassroots people-powered foreign policy series in the country, which we do in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Series. Each year we have 8 topics, which are picked by the Foreign Policy Association, and we animate them with speakers who are addressing the topics in the book. We have a real treat today, which is Eric Berger, who is speaking. He is the author of the topic that he will be addressing, which is outer space. Throughout the series, we've got some great topics. If you're not signed up for the whole series, you can sign up for the series. The series ticket is for members. If you are not a member, you'd like to sign up, you can do that at worldoregon.org, or you can renew there as well. And it is a great way to not only see the series, but save $10 in the process. In past years, we have sold the books for the Great Decision series. Because of the pandemic, we are not selling them. We are actually asking people to go to the Foreign Policy website to order them. I'm going to put a link to that in the chat here. There we go. And a couple things new this year. We are, in addition to the 8-week series, we are doing a discussion series that we are doing in partnership with the Global Leadership and Management Specialization at Portland State University in the Hatfield School. They are our partner this year, and we're very glad to have them. And you can find out all the information on the rest of the series in a link that I will give to you right now in the chat. And I'm going to introduce today's speaker in a sec, but I wanted to remind you that, as in past years, we are recording. We will be doing, we will post to YouTube. We have a Great Decisions playlist that will be up. So if you've missed one, you can go back and you can view it again. And throughout the series, we will have a survey that will be popping up at the program's end. And it would be great if you could take 5 minutes throughout the series and give us your feedback. And that will actually just automatically pop up. And we would appreciate you letting us know what you think. So on to today's program. Very, very excited to have Eric Berger. He is the senior space editor for Ars Technica, covering everything from astronomy to private space to wonky NASA policy. He is the author of the book Liftoff, and I'm going to post a link to that so you can go to our partner Broadway Books and order a copy if you like. And Liftoff is about the rise of SpaceX. Eric has an astronomy degree from the University of Texas and a master's in journalism from the University of Missouri. Previously worked at the Houston Chronicle for 17 years, where the paper was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2009 for his coverage of Hurricane Ike. A certified meteorologist, Eric founded Space City Weather, and he lives in Houston. And without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Eric, and it is all yours, Mr. Berger.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. I'm going to throw up some slides here. I've only got 6 or 8, but I think that's probably preferable to look at than myself. So let me see if I can get this shared here and then get a slideshow view. So, okay, that should, Tim, can you just confirm that that's showing up well?
Yep, we got you.
Okay, great. So I'm going to start out on the other side of the world, just for fun. So Australia was one of the first countries actually in the world to serve as an orbital launch site. This was way back in 1967, a small modified Redstone rocket launched from a place called Woomera in the country. And then in 1971, the first and only successful launch of Great Britain's British Black Arrow rocket launched from Woomera. And I've got here a really cool photo of the launch. Again, this was 1971. This was just as NASA was putting humans on the moon, and already Great Britain had built an orbital rocket. Again, this is 50 years ago, 51 years ago. If you look closely, you'll see that there's no exhaust from the rocket. This is because it launched from Australia, and all they had to do was release it, because Australia is upside down and gravity did the work. Okay, all right. It actually has to do with a mixture of kerosene fuel and peroxide oxidizer, which really doesn't show up, but it's a terrible joke. But what's even more terrible is that the British scrapped their launch program after that and decided it would just be cheaper to buy launches of US rockets. And that's what they've been doing basically ever since, although they've since done some with Europe as well through the European Space Agency. No orbital rockets have launched since from Australia. So that's 51 years. And no orbital rockets have ever launched from Britain. Now, why do I start with Australia and Great Britain? Because, over the next couple of years, we can probably expect to see launches from both Australia, this time from an Australian company, and Great Britain, this time from both British and US companies, probably probably before 2025, if not sooner. And this is really sort of just one of many, many symbols that the space domain has changed rapidly during the first 2 decades of the 21st century. We've seen this both with the rise of new national powers, and I'm speaking of China, and the entry of commercial companies, and I'm going to talk about SpaceX, shaking up what long had been a pretty static environment. So there'd been all this activity in the 1960s and 70s, and then basically it just died off for a bit. So I'm going to talk about that and talk about what got things going again and sort of where we're headed in the future. And so, China has really begun doing some interesting things in space, such as landing a rover on the far side of the moon. And as I mentioned, SpaceX has built the world's largest rocket with its own private funding. And SpaceX now operates more satellites, and it's not even close, than any other country or company in the world. In fact, a rocket just launched this week, a Falcon 9 rocket. This is a single first stage that's been reused 10 times now. With the launch this week, it had launched a total of 550 satellites. This is the same first stage. By way of comparison, in its entire history, the Indian space program has launched 350 satellites. So it's like, the world is changing. The world is changing rapidly. And so in this new era, China and SpaceX are but the exemplars of a range of new actors creating new opportunities and threats in space. So whereas the 20th century saw the dawn of the space age, the 21st century should see its maturity. But what that maturity looks like, I'm not sure. So today I want to step back and talk a little bit about how we got there and what it means for the future of space. So basically from Sputnik in 1957, that was obviously the first satellite launched into orbit, to around 1990, space was dominated by 2 major players. There was the United States, and there was the Soviet Union. In the United States, of course, you had both military with Atlas and Delta rockets, and you had NASA with the Apollo program, and then followed on with the space shuttle. And then the Soviet Union, you primarily had the Soyuz rocket and then the Proton rocket. And there were typically, more than 100 launches a year, and all but a very tiny handful were conducted by the United States and the Soviet Union. After that time, however, so for the last 25 or 30 years, Europe, especially with its Ariane 5 rocket, became the provider of the first commercial launch services. That means if a company or a country had a satellite and enough money, Europe would put it into orbit, and typically these would go to geostationary space. So the Ariane 5 went on to actually capture most of this commercial launch business. And so like telecommunications companies like DirecTV, they wanted to get their big satellites up in the geostationary space. They weren't going to an American company. They were going to Paris and buying launches from Arianespace. The bottom line is that the US rocket companies were not competitive during this era. The 2 main launch providers, Lockheed Martin and Boeing, received large contracts from the US military to develop their Alice and Delta rockets. So this is in the 1990s and early 2000s. And the US military was looking to modernize its fleet of rockets to get its spy satellites and other assets into space. And so they basically gave the two main companies, Lockheed Martin and Boeing, these big contracts. And so they had, because these companies had guaranteed revenues from the launch of the military satellites, their rockets just were not competitive on the international stage. So that actually ended up to them struggling. This is Lockheed Martin and Boeing again, because they were entirely reliant on the government. And the government was saying, we cannot pay you, billions of dollars a year just to keep your rockets in service. You really need to go find other customers. And so long story short, the military actually stepped in and forced them to combine. And so there's a company today called the United Launch Alliance, which actually represents 50% interest of Lockheed and 50% interest of Boeing. And so by the early 2000s, the US was well on the way to having the space shuttle by NASA, which was not doing any commercial launches at that point. And then a single company called United Launch Alliance, which was kind of this big lumbering conglomeration that did the military launches. And so, NASA was still flying the space shuttle. The Russians were relying on technology that had been built in the 1960s and 70s with the Soyuz and Proton rocket. And there just wasn't that much innovation going on in the government space programs and in the large aerospace companies. It was pretty complacent. And so this really provided an opening for a multiplicity of emerging nations and commercial space companies to compete with, and in some ways supersede traditional players in space. So if you look at this space environment graphic really quickly, you'll see off to the right that it goes to about 2019, sorry, that sort of the number of launches is starting to creep back up, and you see that orange line, China, rising, and the yellow line is rising too. That's the United States. Well, as a matter of fact, if this graphic showed the year 2021, it would be the highest number. There were more launches this year, about 140 than ever before to orbit, more successful launches to orbit this year, and that was led by China, and second place was SpaceX. So this country, China, and this company, SpaceX, really are sort of leading this transformation of the space industry, and it's very evident in the number of launches by year. Sort of we've caught back up to the pace of launches from decades ago. So let's start with the rise of China. China aspires to project soft power as a leader in civil spaceflight, and then hard power through military space activity. So it's really trying to do both. And this is because China sees space as a means to place itself on an equal footing in the United States as the only superpower in the world. If they were to land humans on the moon, they would become only a second country to do so. And they aspire to actually move beyond the United States in space. And they're well on their way to sort of matching the United States, although they have a ways to go. So stepping back, before 2003, so less than 20 years ago, China averaged fewer than 5 launches a year. And they were using space to put up a few observation and some communication satellites. But that was really a watershed moment for China, as they became only the third nation after the US and Russia to put a human into space. That year, they also launched the core module of a small space station called Heavenly Palace. And I'm sorry, they launched a small space station there that sort of to learn some things, and then just a couple of years ago they launched the core module of a much larger space station called Heavenly Palace, and that's what this picture is of the 3 astronauts on board. Now it does look a lot like the International Space Station if you've seen pictures of the ISS. It's smaller than the International Space Station, but it's built similarly through modular construction, and it's going to perform a lot of the same functions in terms of scientific research and international relationships. So, for example, the US and Russia and Europe and Japan and Canada have had this great sort of diplomatic partnership on the ISS for more than 2 decades. There are now European astronauts who are training in China and learning Chinese and who will go to the space station. And so there's this competition, I think, between the United States and China to sort of draw countries away to go with them on their exploration program. And so I think in the 2020s and the 2030s, there will kind of be the United States program to explore the moon. And I think there will be a Chinese program to explore the moon. And so there's going to be a competition. The United States has already done this. They have the Artemis program, and they've actually created this thing called the Artemis Accords. And they've gotten about 12 or 13 countries to sign on. And if you sign onto that, you sort of agree to openly share data and sort of these other norms. Russia hasn't signed on to that. China isn't going to sign on to that. So there's going to be a Chinese effort to explore. And there's going to be real competition, I think. So like if you're France, do you go along with the United States, who you're comfortable with and have partnered with for 20 years, or do you go along with China, who maybe is offering some other kind of economic incentive, or maybe will promise to put a French astronaut on the moon 3 years before the United States can? So that's one really interesting thing to watch, kind of that diplomatic competition for partners in space exploration. Until now, the United States has kind of had a monopoly, but I think that's going to change. There are other metrics by which to gauge China's success in space. So we talked about how they were launching 5 rockets a year or less. Now they're launching 40 to 50 a year. And again, this year, by far, launched more orbital rockets than any other country. They also took another big step forward last year by soft landing the Tianwen spacecraft on Mars. So before this spacecraft landed on Mars, only NASA had ever successfully landed on the red planet and seen the spacecraft survive for more than a few seconds. And it wasn't for lack of trying. The Soviet Union sent several missions to Mars to attempt soft landings, and the European Space Agency had as well. None were successful. And then China comes along with his very first mission to Mars. They send an orbiter, a spacecraft detaches from that orbiter, lands on Mars, and then a couple of days later, a rover rolls down these tracks here and is now roving around the surface of Mars. As if it were easy to do. It's not. It's extraordinarily difficult to do this. And so China's deep exploration program now trails only that of NASA. And even at that point, they're trying to catch up. So within the last couple of years, China's been finalizing plans to develop 2 large rockets, one that's going to look a lot, I think, like the Falcon Heavy, and another one that's much bigger called the Long March 9. These rockets are both at least a few years away from coming into existence, but one or both of them could be part of a Chinese program to land on the moon. And I think it's possible we could see Chinese astronauts on the moon in 8 or 10 years from now, even faster if they really committed to it. So at this point, in 2022, if you were to rank sort of the hierarchy of the global space programs, it's the United States, number 1. The U.S. spends almost 10 times more money than any other nation in space, and then China, and then very much sort of behind them, you would come with Russia, the European Space Agency, and then sort of in Japan, I would put up there, and then kind of India and everyone else after that. Okay, so that's a quick review of the international scene. Now let's talk about commercial space and its commercial space era, which has a clear beginning, I would say, and that's with the founding of SpaceX in 2002. They were certainly not the first private space company, but they were the most successful, and by far, they have done the most, and just sort of had this huge transformative effect on the entire industry. They struggled a lot early on. And if you're interested in that, I wrote a book about it called Liftoff, where I spoke at length with Elon Musk and all of the other key early employees. If you doubt the struggles, the photo on the right is Elon in a hangar on Kwajalein, looking at all the parts they recovered from the first Falcon 1 rocket that they launched and crashed into the coral reef there surrounding the little island that they were on in the Pacific. And they would fail twice more before finally finding some success in September 2008. And it's a great story about Elon, but also the people who he hired that worked so damn hard to make the Falcon 1 successful. So after they got through those lean years, by 2010, SpaceX really started to get going. They launched the Falcon 9 rocket, which was much larger than the Falcon 1. And as that rocket has been perfected over this last decade, It's now launched more times than any other rocket since the space shuttle, and very quickly is going to surpass the space shuttle in terms of launches. It's put humans into space with Crew Dragon several times now safely. SpaceX has won contracts to send cargo to the moon and even land humans on the moon. So SpaceX has gone from within 10 years to a potential NASA contractor to the space agency's most important contractor by far. And frankly, we're really seeing the steps today that probably will lead to a bona fide humans to Mars program involving SpaceX and NASA later this decade or early in the 2030s. I'm not sure when the landings are going to come. That's probably a ways off, but it's clear that that's where this is headed as long as SpaceX continues to deliver like it has. So this is a success of SpaceX, and financially they're valued at more than $100 billion now, has sparked a legion of follow-up companies to cash in on the appetites of investors for space. You may have heard of SPACs, these special purpose acquisition companies. They're all over the space industry now, and there's just a lot of money flowing into this. So during the first decade of the 2000s, there were about 40 privately funded space companies, which raised $2 billion from 2000 to 2010. So a pretty small number of companies in the first decade of the 2000s. In the second decade of this century, and this follows that sort of the rise of the Falcon 9, the number of companies, space companies, increased by a factor of 10, and the fundraising likewise went from $2 billion to $20 billion. In documenting this trend, an organization, a venture capital firm called the Space Angels, said that this was the entrepreneurial space age. So that they said that, let me see if I've got this quote here. Oh, no. So they said that the modern space economy was built on 60 years of technology development funded largely by the government. Today, the business model innovation is putting that technology in the hands of entrepreneurs, stimulating competition and creating a dynamic marketplace. The rise of SpaceX and other private companies has lowered launch costs. And this has really helped lead to a rapid increase in the number of small satellites for Earth observation, communications, and more. So you're seeing the first step to any space program is having a way to get into space. That's the rocket. And then once you sort of get the rocket down, and that's what the Falcon 9 really has done, like through rapid reuse, they brought the cost of launch down, and it's really reliable. Like they're launching 30 Falcon 9s a year. And so if you want to ride to space and want it quickly, you can get on their manifest. And so it becomes much more easy to plan businesses in space if you have a reliable and fairly low cost way to get there. And so as launch costs have come down, electronics have become miniaturized, right? Look at what the iPhone has done in terms of development over the last 10 or 15 years. Now imagine some of those same communications observation technologies, like the camera on the iPhone has improved so much from 2008 or 2010. Same things happen in satellites. So you can create much smaller, lighter, more powerful satellites, and you get them into space for a lot less. And so you've had this huge transformation in what we can do in space. So until now, the majority of this startup activity and investment has taken place in the United States. And so we have the deputy director, deputy administrator of NASA, a former astronaut called Pam Melroy, has basically called the U.S. commercial space industry the jewel, of the space industry. And she's right. I mean, the U.S. commercial space industry is the envy of the world. But other countries are taking note. The Chinese government in particular has sought to respond in kind. So as of 2020, the US had about 67% of all startup funding in space. Only about 10% was going to China, but that was still good enough to be second place. And that really is, they're trying to stimulate a new space sector in China, which is a little bit more difficult in an authoritarian government where you don't have kind of the free-flowing economy that you do in the United States. But this goes back to 2016 when there was a white paper on China's space activities, and they expressly said that developing a commercial space industry should be a priority. And that's sort of, this was the language from that paper. And so China basically started licensing its technology to private companies, and now there are more than 100 Chinese companies in space, some launch, some satellites, doing interesting things. And then India in 2019 started doing it. They created a new space, India Limited, and to do something similar. And Europe, where it's challenging because there's these big state-owned launch enterprises that have dominated rockets, but there are also small companies trying to do the startup thing. And so there's some tension in Europe about whether you're going to really get a viable new space economy or not. Anyway, the bottom line is that at the end of the 2020s, space is more commercial in nature than ever, and the trend toward private space really appears to be accelerating. Again, it's really undeniable. There's all this private money going into space activities, into launch, and then what to do with that launch capability. So what does all this mean? We've talked about sort of the international change and sort of this movement out of a static environment for the United States and Soviet Union kind of dominate everything to new players. China is the most prominent one, but India, Japan has a surprisingly robust space program. European Space Agency and the European industry is a player. And so you have these new international actors and you have these new commercial space actors. And then, so looking ahead, I think space could go one of two ways. We could either go toward, I think, a pretty not good road, which would be conflict in space, or space could actually be sort of a force for coming together diplomatically back on Earth. So the worrying signs are those of like a conflict in space. So a couple of years ago, India did an anti-satellite test, but much more recently in December, Russia blew up one of its old satellites in low Earth orbit. And this threatened the International Space Station with debris, as well as other highly trafficked orbits. And it was really it was hard to see what they were trying to do there, because they have cosmonauts on the International Space Station. They have brand new hardware on the International Space Station. And so it was, were they basically sending a message to other countries saying, look, if we're left behind economically in space, we can still muck up the orbit with debris enough to make it so that you can't use this space either. It was difficult to sort of parse that out. And then much more recently, China called out SpaceX in a diplomatic cable, essentially saying that its Starlink satellites were, they were having to maneuver their space station to get out of the way of Starlink satellites, and that wasn't acceptable. During the Trump administration, the United States talked about dominance in space and created the Space Force. So those trends are bad. You've got lots of activity among the military parts of it to both defend their own satellite assets in space. And so these are spy satellites, these are military communications. And they're very not right now, there even could be the capability on orbit to take out other satellites. And so those are worrisome trends. But I do also have a little bit of hope. Here we are at the outset of the 2020s. And there's been a lot of talk about a new space race, right? And who's that space race going to take place? Is it between the US and China? Is it between, I think, more likely SpaceX and China? But I don't think we have to frame all of this activity as a space race. It's also a potential for cooperation. So it's pretty challenging right now because the NASA is blocked by US law from cooperating with China in space by the Wolf Amendment. And this was basically to prevent the illegal transfer of US technology to China, the Chinese government. And I understand why that's in place, but it sort of prevents any kind of cooperation between the US and China. It seems pretty grim, right? Between the US and China diplomatically, but you got to remember in the 1960s, the United States and Soviet Union were in the middle of a Cold War. They were competing to fly humans to the moon. And it was sort of this big competition to win hearts and minds. So at the moment when the US and China relationship is this minefield, I think there's an opportunity potentially for the two countries to find common ground, by working toward international exploration goals in space. I'm not sure exactly what that will take place, what form that will take. I could envision an international mission to Mars potentially. And if you think about it, like getting together and sort of having US, Chinese, Russian astronauts sort of all together to take humanity's first step onto another planet, That would be pretty cool, pretty uniting, something the world could get behind. And it seems unlikely right now, but fewer than 3 years after Eugene Cernan left the moon, he was the last person to walk on the moon in 1972. NASA and the Soviet Union astronauts met one another in low Earth orbit as the Apollo and Soyuz vehicles docked. And then they partnered ever since, culminating with the International Space Station for the last 20 years. So I do think space could serve to ease tensions on Earth. But I don't know if we're going to get there. Like, as I say, there's these trends toward militarization and competition, and then there's the potential for cooperation. And so what happens over the next 5 to 10 years, I think, is so important when it comes to space. And so I'm glad, that some of these issues are getting out there. And so I think we're about to the point now where we can, I'm more than happy to take questions on anything related to any of these topics. So I will stop sharing the screen. Thank you.
Great. Eric, this is Tim DeRoche. This is the disembodied voice of Tim DeRoche. I'm coming to you from outer space. I'm gonna stay off screens and keep the conversation on you. Let's start a little bit with, you've hinted that space is transitioning from a phase of discovery to phases of security and commerce. And do you think that we are sacrificing discovery and deeper exploration in the name of security and commerce? And is that a problem?
No, I don't think we're sacrificing that. Actually, discovery is proceeding right on pace. NASA just succeeded in launching with the European Space Agency the James Webb Space Telescope. And that, was a $10 billion instrument, had a potential to fail. And lo and behold, it looks like it's going to work, and it's going to be a fantastic instrument for looking back at the earliest galaxies. NASA is going to launch this year. Actually, SpaceX is going to launch for NASA the Psyche mission, to our first mission to a metallic asteroid. In a couple of years, SpaceX is going to launch a probe to Europa, this ice-covered moon of Jupiter. NASA just announced some missions to Venus to go back to that planet, and we're going to fly a helicopter to Titan, a moon around Saturn. And so I think discovery is going onward. It's just, we've seen the entree of these new actors. And so in addition to discovery, you're sort of layering on top of that commercial and increasing military activities. And if there's a problem, it's that there will be a collision between some of those interests. And then in that case, your Discovery Act programs might lose. But right now, no, the science aspect of NASA, I think, is as healthy as it's ever been.
Well, so I read that 95% of, I think it's 300 billion in revenue that's earned in the space sector was from the space for Earth economy. So telecom, internet, Earth observation, national security, yet space for space economy, things like mining the moon, asteroids, that's actually kind of struggling. Do you see the former upending the latter in terms of priorities?
So you can make a buck in all of those areas you talked about, the space for Earth. And that's sort of where we have, where companies traditionally made money. The business case for the moon is difficult, and there is no business case for Mars. So that's why, for the time being, you really need a NASA to lead exploration of the moon, because while companies want to go along and sort of explore the possibility of mining water or metals or silicon on the surface of the moon, it's not something you can just start a company and go do, because it's enormously expensive and there's lots of technology that needs to be proven out. So for the time being, NASA will lead on that.
So you mentioned, the explosion of space actors. I mean, it's not the 1960s space race any longer. I mean, you mentioned Russia, China, Japan, India. I mean, we're even seeing, Luxembourg, the UAE in here. When it comes to thinking about promoting stability, harmony, and freedoms, how will rule of law in space look in the future?
Nobody knows, and that's a great question, because the International Space Treaty was signed in 1967, So, to some extent, we're still being guided by those laws. And so we've seen a couple of things that are probably going to prompt a pretty significant rethink of all of this. One is the Artemis Accords, which I mentioned, which if you want to go back to the moon with NASA and the Artemis program, you've got to sign on. And this sort of sets out some norms. And most of it's pretty reasonable, right? Like, you cannot claim territory on the moon. You have to try to manage your orbital debris. If you do science on the moon, you have to share that data freely. But there are also, like, if you're a company and you find something on the moon that you want to mine, a private company, you have the right to do that. And so it's sort of superseding international law in some of those areas. And so that's one area. Another area is these anti-satellite tests that I talked about. There's going to be a pretty big effort, I think, over the next year or two to stop those tests from happening, because they create debris in low Earth orbit, and that's really a problem. And why are we having these pissing contests? We already know that the United States, Russia, China, India, probably Japan, and a couple other countries can shoot down satellites. Do we need to keep demonstrating that ability? This is pretty harmful when that happens. And then finally, another forcing factor, I think, is the problem of orbital debris, right? There's lots of crap up there, and some of it comes back. It gets dragged down over time by the atmosphere, and so it sort of low Earth orbit sort of cleans itself out slowly. But then you've got SpaceX putting up 10,000 or more Starlink satellites, and it's not just SpaceX. Amazon wants to do that with Project Kuiper. Telesat wants to do that. China wants to do that. Russia has a plan, a Sphere plan for its own satellites. So many more satellites are coming to low Earth orbit, and that creates many more opportunities for collisions and even more debris. And we really need some kind of international framework to allow, like, SpaceX to communicate with China, right? Or to at least upload data, like have a database of all known objects in orbit and share that, so that we can move the International Space Station out of harm's way or whatever. So yeah.
So it's a little bit like the LA freeway. I mean, we're looking at a lot of congestion.
Well, it's like the LA freeway, but at least on the LA freeway, like, there's lanes, right? And in space, and cars are going fast in the LA freeway, but maybe not 20,000 miles per hour. And so it's just, I mean, collisions are really bad, basically, in space, because things are going so fast. You create this enormous amount of debris.
So we have a question from the audience. Are Russia and China planning, or are they already cooperating in space?
So they're sort of cooperating. The heads of the Russian and Chinese space agencies have signed an agreement to work together on a lunar exploration program. But I'm skeptical about what that's really going to look like, because Russia, quite frankly, doesn't have a whole lot to offer in terms of funding, or even, I think, experience in lunar environment. So I think it's going to primarily be a Chinese program, but China is going to try to build a lunar exploration program to counter the US program. And so from a diplomatic standpoint, peeling off Russia from the United States, because the US and Russia have been cooperating on the International Space Station for so long, sort of symbolically, I think that's important for China to do that.
We have a question from another audience member about what is the ground infrastructure needed to truly expand this type of development?
What type of
increasingly more commercialized. I'm assuming this is what she means by her question. An increasingly commercialized and privatized space.
So it depends. It depends. When you're launching rockets, there are some rockets that have a very minimalist setup, like you just need a concrete pad, and then you can bring in the stuff you need on 3 or 4 flatbed trucks. So in that sense, you could launch from almost anywhere. And then, like, you have companies like Blue Origin building brand new launch pads at Cape Canaveral, Space Force Station in Florida. And so a lot of the stuff they need is already there. And probably the biggest one is SpaceX with their Starbase or their Starship launch site in South Texas. They need an enormous amount of methane and liquid oxygen to fuel that rocket because it's so big. And so that is requiring a significant amount of infrastructure to be built in South Texas. And there's a big environmental review of that going on by the FAA that should be completed in about 6 weeks.
Well, it sounds like there was a sort of a personal connection in that question. She worked for Jet Propulsion Labs from the 70s onward. So,
Yeah,
um,
JPL does great work.
so outside of nation states and alliances, corporations are a driving force, having been making money in Earth orbit for over 50 years. How is this going to be kept in check? And do you think we're going to see increasingly commercial developments like on-orbit satellite servicing pushing our defense capabilities? And are there concerns about that?
So right now, when you look at commercial activity in space, there really are no checks on that. Like, if you have enough money, you can do almost anything on orbit. The FCC will limit you in terms of if you want to sell services back on Earth, you have to get an FCC license. And they did stop one company called AST Space Mobile from building satellites that were about the size of the International Space Station because NASA objected to that because they had such a huge cross-sectional area for debris, although they may ultimately get permission to do it anyway. But the FCC is very permissive. The FAA is there to basically make sure that when you launch on a rocket, you're not threatening, civilians on the ground or property on the ground. So it's a very permissive environment. And maybe that starts to be limited as we go down the road, but right now there's no framework really to do that. So you have these low Earth orbit internet mega constellations that people have probably heard of Starlink, but as I said, there's others, Project Kuiper at Amazon coming along. And there's no check, like they are generally getting permissions they need to put up thousands of satellites. And what are the implications for that? I don't know, but potentially not good. And the question almost also mentioned like on-orbit servicing. And so Northrop Grumman has done some really interesting work on that over the last couple of years, developing a vehicle basically where they can go and refuel satellites that otherwise would have to be put out of service. And I think we're going to see more of that. As low Earth orbit becomes more crowded, there will be opportunities to potentially remove debris or at least make it easier to deorbit your satellites so that you're not creating the potential for more debris. And I'm not sure what that in-space economy looks like, but there are definitely interesting things coming in that regard.
Another question is, I think, a clarification question from an audience member. In speaking of overcrowding of orbits, you speak as if there's only one orbit or distance from Earth. Are there not many possible orbits and distances?
There are of course many possible orbits from Earth, low Earth orbit, a couple 100 kilometers above the surface of the planet, all the way out to geostationary, but all the way out to the moon, which frankly is still in orbit around the Earth. So yes, there are a multiplicity of orbits, but there are some that are a lot more valuable than others. For example, geostationary orbit, which is about 36,000 kilometers above the planet. That is the orbit at which the satellite is falling around the planet at the same velocity which the Earth is rotating. And so your satellite's always looking down at the same spot on the planet. There's concern about debris there always. And then there's very much concern about this distance from about 300 kilometers to about 1,100 kilometers. That's sort of the low Earth orbit. And that's where a lot of these mega constellations want to set up operations. That's where the International Space Station is. That's where the Chinese Tiangong Space Station is. That's where a lot of valuable NASA and military satellites are. And so, yes, there are many orbits, but the most valuable ones are sort of at geostationary and then sort of low Earth orbit between 300 and say about 1,000 or 1,100 kilometers above the planet.
So you've mentioned a couple other companies like Grumman. How do other companies in the commercial space in the United States stack up against SpaceX, such as Blue Origin or Virgin Galactic? Does SpaceX have that much of a lead over such companies?
So in terms of suborbital space tourism, Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin are the clear leaders. But when you want to talk about orbital space flight, there's no competition. I mean, SpaceX is absolutely very far ahead of Blue Origin, which has never launched an orbital rocket. Is building one, but that probably is at least a couple of years away. And then they're going to have to go through some growing pains, I think, with New Glenn. And then, United Launch Alliance, which I mentioned in my talk, is there and is capable and has a fantastic safety record, but they're expensive and they don't have many customers. Like SpaceX in December of 2021 launched 5 rockets. Okay. United Launch Alliance in all of 2021 launched 5 rockets. So in terms of orbital launch, there really is no competition in the United States anymore. It's SpaceX and everyone else. And everyone else may catch up or may make some strides. But with Starship, SpaceX is building a vehicle that sort of would take the next step. So if you're trying to catch up to the Falcon 9, by the time you get there, sort of SpaceX will be on to the next thing. So they have a huge lead. Now, they do not. There's certainly companies better able to do things like Boeing has a fantastic record managing the International Space Station, right? So they have the lead in that. Boeing and especially Lockheed Martin have a great record at building satellites, and Lockheed Martin does a fantastic job working with JPL building spacecraft, to go to planets and around the solar system. So SpaceX does not have a monopoly in all areas, but certainly in launch and now human spaceflight, they are far and away the leaders.
So we were talking before the program about, we had a program yesterday on the governance of oceans and the freedom of the seas as kind of an analogy. In thinking about securing international cooperation and freedom of navigation within the global commons of space, I have to ask a question about the Space Force. What has been the international reaction to the Space Force? Was it necessary? Is it seen as overreach? I'm real curious, both from your personal stance, but also what's the conversation you're hearing among space colleagues? So
the Space Force, really is just kind of an extension of what the Air Force was already doing under a new name. It's obviously not sending Marines up into space or anything like that. It's basically the Space Force's job is to launch satellites for the US military and to make sure those assets are protected. And they do a pretty good job of it. But a lot of the rhetoric around the Space Force, as I say, Vice President Mike Pence, who was, by the way, an extremely thoughtful person when it came to US spaceflight and was certainly the most engaged vice president on this issue in a long time. He talked about space dominance, and that really rubbed would-be allies in Europe the wrong way. And Russia was not having any of that, and that sort of pushed them away, I think, as a partner. Now, Russia has done a lot of things I don't like in space that should be pushing NASA away, I think, too. But I think it's accelerated this trend toward the militarization of space. And I'd love to claw that back, but I don't know how to do it.
Well, and thinking about that, much has been said about the security advantage point of space. Talking about space as the ultimate high ground, as it contains key, quote unquote, terrain with regard to surveillance warfare. Do you think we're going to see a new Cold War or a heightened return of great power competition?
I mean, that is well within the possibility of what we're going to see in space between China and the United States. We're already seeing it to some extent. China is positioning itself to do a lot of really, novel, interesting things in space that would set it apart from other countries on Earth and sort of place it alongside the United States. And that will happen, I think, as long as there's no cooperation between the U.S. and China in space.
So we have a question from the audience, and they frame it as saying, this is a very basic question, but it's a good question, about how many satellites and rockets and space stations are in the sky.
So rockets go up and then they come down generally, although some of the spent stages stay up in space. But Satellites, there are, I don't have the number in front of me, but I think there are probably about 5 to 7,000, very roughly. It's not entirely my area of expertise. And then like in terms of debris, and this is like everything from spent rocket stages to old satellites that have run out of fuel to pieces of stuff that was blown up by anti-satellite tests to just, there are like about 20,000 roughly pieces of debris that are being tracked, and many multiples of that smaller that can't be tracked flying around in low Earth orbit.
Okay. So we were talking about your trajectory as a writer. You've been writing about space for, you said, what, 15 years? What inspired you originally to go down the road you did? I mean, it's a fairly niche area, and at the time you did, we weren't really. I mean, space exploration was pretty quiet.
I've always been interested in space since I was a kid. I remember looking at photos from the Voyager spacecraft in the 1980s and being like, wow, these are really cool views of like the planets that we're seeing for the first time. And so that was pretty inspiring to me. And I kind of came back to it in the early 2000s because I was working for the Houston Chronicle at the time and helping our space guy in the aftermath of the space shuttle Columbia accident in 2003. And after one story I wrote, I got a call from a guy named Chris Kraft, who it turned out lived about half a mile down the road from me in Clear Lake in the Houston area. And Chris Kraft was the first flight director at NASA, one of the original employees of NASA. The mission control in Houston at Johnson Space Center is now named Chris Kraft Mission Control. He was really one of by far the most important people at NASA that led to the human landing on the moon, and then sort of was very influential thereafter. And I struck up kind of a quasi friendship with him. I would go over to his house, and he was in his 90s at the time. Well, he's in the late 80s when we started, in late 90s when our friendship continued. And I would just go over there about once every other month, and we would just sit upstairs in his little den area and talk for a couple hours about different things. And so that just sort of helped rekindle my interest in space and really kind of fueled my passion, because he was frustrated. Here was someone who had been at the top of his game, like right when he was in his 30s, right, and done this amazing thing, sort of helped lead the human landing back on the moon, and then had sat there for 40 or 50 years and watched as we hadn't gone back and had not really gone further. And as in later in life, that really frustrated him. And so some of that rubbed off on me. And so I just sort of got pretty passionate, like, why haven't we been back to the moon? Right? Well, what's going on? And that really got me involved in sort of understanding space policy and how screwed up it was, and how these forcing factors, that are talked about today, China, and particularly commercial space, had a chance to change that. And so again, that sort of ignited a lot of my passion and sort of my interest in reporting.
So we've talked so much about commercialization and privatization, but you also touched on the potential for outer space exploration as a form of really grand diplomacy. How do you think we're going to manage those competing interests of something that can absolutely unite us and something that is going to drive competition?
Well, a great test over the next 5 to 10 years will be the International Space Station, which is this phenomenal engineering marvel in low Earth orbit. It's huge. It's taken 20 years to build, and it's brought together the United States, Europe, Russia, Japan, Canada, and it's coming to an end. It's going to fly till about 2030. And so what happens after that? Is NASA able to keep that team together and go to the moon? Or does the Artemis program fall apart like so many other deep space exploration programs have? And NASA is going to replace the International Space Station with private space stations. And so if you're Europe, Italy, France, Great Britain, do you want to pay a US company to send your astronauts up there? I don't know. And so, at the same time, China's going to be trying to pick off international partners for its space programs. And so, I come back to the idea that the next 5 to 10 years are really pivotal in terms of where all this goes.
Well, and all of this conversation, it's in many ways like a page out of sci-fi. I mean, I'll remind our audience that Soylent Green was set in 2022, and we are here now. But a question from the audience, and this is a good one, because this is the kind of thing that figures into some of the, some great sci-fi movies. If SpaceX, a corporation, were to launch an Xfinity satellite that is destroyed by a country like, say, China, what are the ramifications? And then you get non-state actors like corporations basically going head to head with nations. What will we do?
Well, that would be the job of the U.S. Space Force to respond to that. And I assume that they would. I mean, Elon Musk is in a really interesting position because Tesla does business in China. So, he's never really critical of China for that reason. And so what would his response to that be? I don't know, but the U.S. would respond pretty, so all these anti-satellite tests that we've seen to date have been countries, knocking out their old satellites. So no country's ever going after another country's satellites. That would be an act of war. I mean, that would be really no different than, a Russian government, taking a pot shot at a corporate building in San Francisco or whatever. I mean, you're attacking another. It would be bad.
So, in the realm of sci-fi, let's talk about colonization. It's certainly still in the realm of, speculative narratives. And we've never had more than 13 people in space at one time, correct me if I'm wrong, but what are your thoughts on the reality of this in our lifetimes?
So there's really only one reason for humans to go to Mars, and it's not to do science. It's not to plant a flag. It's to do space settlement. And the people who believe in space settlement, I am one of them, are those who think that one day humans will be living on Earth-like worlds around other stars. And we can't get to those stars today, and won't be for a long time. But we're going to have to learn how to live on other worlds. And there's no other Earth in our solar system, no other planets to come close. But the next best option, is inhospitable as it is Mars. And so if we're going to get on with space settlement and become a spacefaring species, we had better start. And so the Mars is the place to do that. And so NASA's not tasked with doing space settlement. No International Space Agency isn't. But that's what SpaceX is created for. And so you have this really interesting situation where by far the most successful spaceflight company in the world is SpaceX, and its primary mission is sending humans to Mars and ultimately building a self-sustaining settlement there. So will they succeed? I don't know, but it's certainly going to be fascinating to watch, and one of the reasons why this is such a great industry to be involved in and tracking, because it's become so increasingly dynamic.
Well, we are coming up on our hour. Eric, I want to thank you for all of your fantastic insight. I want to thank the audience for some really, really good questions. Again, this is the first of 8 of our Great Decisions series. We will be posting this to our YouTube channel after the fact, so you can review it or you can share it. Really would love for you all to join us next week for a look at how changing demographics are reshaping the global landscape of how decisions, both great and small, are being made. It should be a really, really great look. Again, stay safe out there. I'm glad you could join us. Glad we can have this incredible technology to be able to connect, just like the technology that brings us out into orbit. So have a great day. We will see you next week. Eric, thank you so very much, and we will see you soon.
My pleasure. Thank you, Tim. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.